Hello and good morning, everybody. It is me, Julian, and today I would like to talk about one of my favorite movies, being The Grand Beauty by the Italian director Paolo Sorrentino. And I'd like to briefly introduce you to this film and what it's about and attempt a brief philosophical analysis. So, The Grand Beauty tells the story of Jep Gambardella, a retired writer who was a literary sensation in his youth, having written a short novella titled The Human Condition, and afterwards he simply retired and became a socialite of sorts. He's essentially a kind of flaneur, a flaneur who walks the streets of Rome by day and parties hard at night, enjoying being what you might call gainfully unemployed. In fact, there's a wonderful line in the movie where Jep says that after the age of 65, he decided that he really didn't want to waste his time doing anything he didn't want to do. But it turns out what he enjoys doing most is wasting his time. He enjoys doing nothing. In fact, he's obsessed with the idea of nothing. He says he admires the French author Flaubert, who once wanted to write a book about nothing. And yet, Jep hasn't found the literary recipe to write about nothing. And so instead, he simply does nothing. He dedicates himself to the grand beauty of simply being a ghost, a shadow, walking the streets of Rome. Now, I personally love this film. It's a film that I return to over and over again for myriad reasons. I love the way in which it plays with time and space. I enjoy the overt nods to Fellini's La Dolce Vita. I enjoy Sorrentino's ironic, mock-transcendental style. But above all, what I like about this film is that its core, its essence, is about a man facing the question, how to live his life, and how to find a reason to live and indeed a reason to create again. In this sense, I think that Sorrentino's The Grand Beauty is actually very similar to Hayao Miyazaki's The Wind Rises. The central question of Sorrentino's work, similar to that of Miyazaki, is always, how can we find a reason to live? What could possibly be the point of life? And Jep Gambardella is a figure who simply detaches himself from everything. He has a sardonic, ironic distancing. And so he can never fully invest himself. He can never fully love. He can never fully give himself to anything. He's always seeing through things. He's essentially a kind of cynic. And this allows him to essentially become a ghost. There's a wonderful Proustian flavor to this film, which is to say, if In Search of Lost Time is the process by which the narrator discovers how to write a book, The Grand Beauty is a film about a writer rediscovering his reason to write and thereby to live. And without wanting to spoil it, the discovery that Jep makes is the rediscovery of a long-lost memory of a love, of a moment in his life in which beauty seemed, for a brief instance, to be tangible. And one of the things that I really admire about Sorrentino's filmmaking is that even though he has an ironic touch, which is to say, it's never sentimental or romantic, he nevertheless allows and grants his characters some sense of redemption. Towards the end of the film, Jep indeed has a moment in which he realizes that he can perhaps write once more. And there's a wonderful encounter that he has with a saint-like figure. Indeed, the religious elements run throughout this entire novel. There's a great quote from Proust in which he says, "Even though I am not religious, there is no day from which religious thoughts are absent." And you could say the same thing about this movie. This is an entirely secular, indeed atheist movie, and yet there is no scene from which religious and transcendental considerations are absent, as befits a great work of art, of course. Now, to return to the movie, at a certain point, Jep Gambardella encounters a living saint who never speaks. And at a certain point, when she's asked and pressed as to why she does not speak, she says, "I took a vow of poverty, and one does not speak of poverty." It's a wonderfully profound moment, and one can see that it is one of the two instances in which Jep is genuinely moved in this film. because she essentially articulates his central problem. He is a writer, and yet he has dedicated himself to beauty. And how can one speak of beauty without diminishing it? How can one write down a human emotion or experience without tarnishing it in advance? The second moment in which Jep is genuinely moved, and I think this is the most profound sequence in the film, is when he essentially explains to a young woman, his lover, how she is to conduct herself at that greatest of social theatrical events, namely a funeral. In fact, to give you a little bit of backstory, one of his friends, a wealthy heiress, has a son who is mentally unstable and after reading Proust, commits suicide. Jep appears at the funeral in his standard, cynical way. He essentially sees the funeral as an occasion to make a kind of social appearance, and he feigns and tells and instructs the woman how she is to feign her grief and exactly what questions she is to ask. He makes a dramatic entrance in the church so that everybody can see him. And yet, at a certain point in the service, there is the question that is raised: who will carry the coffin? Are there any friends who will carry the coffin for this young man? And the friends of the young man are in attendance, and yet none of them stands up. They all refuse to participate in this final rite. And it is that exact moment that we have an instance of ambiguity in which Jep begins to cry. And we can't really tell if he is genuinely crying or if he is feigning it. And Jep gets up and becomes one of the pallbearers. And to my mind, this is another very important scene in the film. It's a moment in which Jep's facade cracks, in which he suddenly realizes that his own cynicism is withholding him from the most rich experiences in life. He realizes that he himself is friendless, and that when he is gone, nobody will miss him. Now, these are but two of the small episodes in this film, for indeed it is an episodic film. Its sense of time is simply that of Jep's own. It flows and it ebbs, and we have little scenes and snapshots. Essentially, it's a writer walking through Rome, taking it all in. And yet these two scenes are scenes in which Jep has encounters with what you might call the transcendental. The idea that it is possible to give oneself to something, to risk it all, and to love and thereby to live. Hence, to my mind, the central message, if art can have a message, of the grand beauty is that it takes courage to live. It takes courage to find a reason to live and to give oneself to something, and that to create shouldn't just be a way of exempting oneself from the world. It should be a way of actually accessing the world more directly. Jep, to my mind, is a hero of sorts. He says that when he came to Rome as a young man, he wanted to become the king of the high life. And instead, he becomes a flaneur. He becomes a ghost, a socialite, who is too cynical and too detached to ever truly believe in anything. And this allows him to feel superior to other people, and yet it makes him feel empty, isolated, and alone. And as he's aging, he realizes just how much he's missed. And this makes him, to my mind, a Proustian hero. It's a film about how to create. And at the end of the film, Jep has found, once again, the courage to begin writing. And so it is a movie about salvation. It is a film about finding something to believe in. And if you watch more of Sorrentino's work, you'll recognize that all of his films are about this belief, finding a reason and a way to live. That is The Grand Beauty by Paolo Sorrentino. Thank you so much. I'm going to post this instead of a live stream today, as I am going to be away. But thank you for watching, and I will see you tomorrow.